I'm excited to talk to you about memory, and for some reason the slide advancer is not working. Okay. There we go. Okay, perfect. So this is, for those of you who have seen my book, this is a quote that I opened up with my book because I think, even though in some ways I know better, I think my memory is terrible. And this, when I saw this meme, it described me perfectly. This is me. So everybody, when you tell them, oh, I study human memory, and this is true of most memory researchers I know, but it's certainly true of me, is 9 out of 10 people will ask me, why am I so forgetful? Why is my memory so bad? Maybe you can cure me. 1 out of 10 will tell me that their memory is great and they have a photographic memory. They're usually wrong. But we'll get to that. So, but in the meantime, most people think their memory is really bad. And it's kind of odd because if you ask people, are you an above average driver? 9 out of 10 people will say they're an above average driver, when mathematically that's impossible, right? So, but why is it 9 out of 10 people will say they're below average in terms of memory? And I think the reason is that memory sort of puts you in your place. What I'm showing you here is a graph that was actually of data that was acquired in 1885, although many researchers have done studies like this and they find similar results. So this was done by a guy named Hermann Ebbinghaus. I describe kind of the interesting stories behind this research in my book. But the basic thing that he did was he said, I want to study memory. And I want to be able to study memory in the way that physicists study gravity or something like that. I want to be able to quantify memory, right? So if you tell me, oh, I remember seeing my grandmother, blah, 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 I can't quantify that. So what he did was he said, I'm going to study myself and I'm going to memorize a bunch of things. And then I'll see how long I can retain that information. Without going into a lot of details, he used a very kind of interesting measure. And what he said was, I'm just going to wait a certain period of time and see how much of the information that I learn I've managed to save, that I've managed to stick around. And so what he found was, if he waited 20 minutes, if he had memorized everything perfectly, if he waited 20 minutes, he had already lost 40% of what he had memorized. 20 minutes. So he was losing basically 2% per minute, right? So then after like 1 hour, he had already lost half of what he learned. After about 9 hours, or even when you go into a day, he was at like something like 20 to 30%, right? So what this tells you is Ebbinghaus was the most motivated experimental subject you could possibly have. Everybody who's ever been studied that we know of, when you do something that's kind of a boring experiment like this, will show pretty similar results. So what this means is, if you just look at the details, the minutia, most of what you experience in life will be forgotten. It's really the minority of information that you get that you're going to remember. Now, we'll get to some interesting caveats to this, but in general, most of your life will be forgotten, right? If I am lucky, you'll walk away with 3 or 4 points from this talk. And that would be great. That would be a huge success, right? Many people, for those of you who have an academic background, you've probably seen many academic talks, or you come here, you've probably seen many academic talks where you enjoy it, and you go back and somebody says, oh, what happened? And you're like, oh, I don't really remember it, but it was good. So, so the question that I wrote, that I put in the title of my book, is why we remember. Because if forgetting is the default, then the question is, why do we remember everything in the first place? Because our brains are clearly not designed to remember everything. So why do we remember anything? So I'll give you just a tiny bit of dramatically oversimplified neuroscience here for a moment. As I talk about in the book, you can think about neurons as functioning in kind of a democracy. It's a very weird analogy. So neurons are the cells in your brain that communicate with each other. They work together to do things. I realize many of us have election fatigue or election trauma, perhaps. So maybe it's a bad time to talk about democracy. But the basic idea is that we have a bunch of cells in our brain. And none of these neurons in and of themselves are doing anything that is that important. But collectively, these neurons are getting a lot done, okay? And so one way you can think about memories is they come about through a coalition of neurons that are working for a common cause. Now, these neurons talk to each other via chemical communications in these gaps between cells. So if you say, here's a neuron and here's a neuron, they'll be communicating with each other via these chemicals that get communicated across this tiny gap called a synapse. Now, you don't need to remember all that, but here's the important part. So let's say if you have someone, you've met me, this guy with an unusual name, I tell you my name, and so what happens? Well, you have a lot of neurons in your brain that might be active when you meet me, right? And just by being co-activated and not having a memory for me or that name before, what's going to happen is you're going to get a change in the strength of the connections between all of these neurons so that these chemical communications can be much more efficient, okay? And so I'm drawing that here in terms of these black neurons that are basically very schematic, but the point is just to show that these are all a coalition of neurons that would work together. And when these neurons are activated, you can remember my name. So the idea is that when we remember, we think we're replaying a little bit of the conscious experience we had during learning. If these neurons are active when you remember my name, and you can recall some of that coalition later on and bring them out to vote again later, then maybe you'll be able to recall my name, be able to pull together some bits and pieces of what happened. Now, here's the problem. Memories compete with each other. So if you store photos on your phone, every photo is uniquely stored and you can keep doing it over and over again until you run out of space. The brain never runs out of space. To our knowledge, nobody has ever run out of space in their brain. But part of the reason is our brains are very economical. So what our brains do is they use many of the same neurons over and over and over again for different memory. So rather than having just a two-party system like we might do in some democracies, you might instead have a weird system where one voter can be a member of multiple parties, right? Or one neuron can be a member of multiple cell assemblies or coalitions that support different memories, all right? Now, here's where the problem comes in. So let's say if you happen to be like an Indian film buff, you might run into some other guy who's also named Charan, and he kind of looks like me, right? So, I mean, I'm not taking my shirt off for you for decency's sake, but you know, so I wouldn't be offended. It wouldn't be a racist thing if you said, "Oh, wait, weren't you in that movie RRR or something like that?" Right? So, the problem is that let's say if you had seen that movie, then you might activate many of the same neurons that were active when you saw me, because we're kind of similar, let's say. But you might activate some unique neurons kind of weakly. And so what can happen is that once you have these memories that are overlapping and they're kind of similar, we have a whole life of these things. Think of all the places you put your keys, think of all the places you parked your car. Once you have these memories that are overlapping, they're fighting with each other. And the brain can't figure out who's going to win here. Is it going to be memory A or memory B? So that competition is what leads our brains to struggle to remember something. Sometimes the memory is there, but there's so much competition, the coalition of neurons that you want to pull out the right memory just doesn't make it out, okay? And if you think about all the things we forget, some of these things are things that are forgotten in the last 24 hours. Keys, people's names, glasses, cell phones, where did I put my phone? Faces of people. For me, people will be like, oh, I remember faces, but I never remember names. For me, I can't remember faces either. So I'm just terrible. So these are all problems because many of the things that we have to learn are so susceptible to competition. When you think about where you put your keys, you're not trying to remember where you put your keys. You're trying to remember where I put my keys last. Where was the last time I put my keys? But you put your keys in so many places that it's really hard to remember where you put your keys last time because there's so much competition. Likewise, if you're remembering the name of somebody, Well, that name might have been associated with many other people. This person's face might be very similar to other people you've met. And so there's a lot of competition. And it's not like, in the olden days, if somebody was named Baker, they could give you bread and oh, yeah, that's Baker. But right now we don't have that, right? So all these names, they have no reason to be associated with people's faces other than the fact that they just are. Okay. So our brains have a lot of problems with it. So how do any memories survive in this battle, this ecosystem where all these memories are trying survival of the fittest, kill or be killed? How does this happen? Well, one thing is importance. And I know many of you will be like, oh, but there are so many things that are important. Where I put my keys is important. Well, we'll get to some of that in the Q&A. But when I'm talking about importance, I'm not necessarily talking about what society thinks is important or even what you as a conscious self thinks is important, but what evolution thinks is important, right? So if you think about in your life, the things that if I ask you to just come up with 5 memories in your life, you don't have time. Otherwise, I may call people, just say, hey, tell me 5 memories from your life. But if I did, you would probably remember certain events that are associated with strong emotions, right? Things that are associated with fear or excitement, desire, love, surprise, curiosity. Novelty is another one that I put down. Events that are going to be something that really got you going in some way, right? And when we have these emotions, they're associated with physical feelings too. And those feelings are related to chemicals in our brain called neuromodulators. So how many of you have heard of a chemical called dopamine? Okay, good. How many of you have heard of a chemical called serotonin? Okay, how many of you have heard of a chemical called cortisol? Okay, how many of you have heard of noradrenaline? Okay, so most of you, many of you could have kept your hands up. So these are all chemicals in our brain that are released during some of these emotional states. And that's part of the magic that gives us those emotions in the first place. It's not the only thing, but it's a big part. So those chemicals do 2 things. One is they change the way we pay attention and process information, but another is they actually promote plasticity. They make our brain much more receptive to forming new memories. And so the memories that stick around are often the memories that are associated with these intense emotions. So all of these chemicals that are released allow the brain to say, hey, something is biologically important here, right? Because love is going to be related to attachment, which is very evolutionarily important. Fear is going to be associated with threats. And you can bet our cave person ancestors wanted to know where the saber-toothed tiger was, right? So there are all of these different kinds of emotions that are associated with these evolutionarily important motivational circuits that kept us alive for millennia. And that's what's related to these chemicals in the brain. So another factor that helps, though, is even if you formed a memory, sometimes you can't find the memory you're looking for. And actually, I even wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about this, about when people were talking about the president's memory. And I said, a lot of times what happens is not when somebody forgets, it's not because they have dementia, but just because they can't find the information they're looking for. And as we get older, I know for myself, I know I will have a memory in there, but I cannot find it when I need it, right? And so what are the memories that tend to come to mind the easiest? They're memories that have details that make one event stand out from everything else. So I've got here as just an example. I generated this by ChatGPT because I didn't want to actually show you my real desk. But this is a desk that has a bunch of Post-it notes on it, right? So imagine you actually wrote something on these notes. You would, if you wrote it on a pink note, it would be very easy to find, right? But if you wrote something on one of the yellow notes, it'd be very hard to find, right? Memory works in a very similar way. These yellow memories, like if you think of this as a metaphor for memory, these yellow Post-it notes are all competing with each other, but the pink Post-it note stands out. And that's why if you form memories that have a lot of distinctive details in it, it's easy to remember. They can come to mind effortlessly. But the memories that are more blurry, and we'll get to why some of these memories are blurry, but if you have memories that are more blurry and samey, kind of like when you put your keys down and you weren't paying attention, you were on the phone, And those kind of memories, you put your phone in so many places, they all kind of look like they're like yellow post-it notes. Another factor is meaning. So if you have information that's meaningful to you in some way, it allows you to form a richer, more detailed memory, and it allows you to reduce the amount of information that you need to memorize. So there are great studies, for instance, of chess experts, and a chess expert can look at a chessboard and be able to memorize an entire chessboard in one viewing. Like you just show it to them for 20 seconds, then give them a blank board and they'll put all the pieces in the right place. A chess expert who's a grandmaster can probably watch an entire tournament and reproduce an entire sequence of moves in a game that they've just seen. So you might think, oh, well, this is because chess masters are just really smart or they have great memories. But in fact, everybody does this. Everybody has some kind of expertise. I'm sure some of you are baseball fans and can recite baseball statistics like really easily. And for those of you who are baseball fans, even if I gave you statistics on somebody who's a new baseball player that you didn't know about, you could probably memorize it very easily because your expertise allows you to do that. In the book, I talk about LeBron James, who's a professional basketball player, his baby, who got the all-time scoring record in the NBA. If you go on YouTube and you actually search LeBron James memory, you will be able to see videos of him going play by play by play in memory, describing an entire sequence of plays. And think about it. In a basketball game, these things are happening, second by second. You're throwing the ball's going back and forth. You got the adrenaline going. And he can give you a play-by-play listing of what happened entirely from memory that's so good that people can actually show the video side by side with his recollection, and it looks like he's got a photographic memory. But really what it is expertise. When you know a lot about something, all of this information that seemed to be arbitrary before has a lot of meaning, and that makes it a lot easier to form memories. Another thing is context. So again, I'm just going to involve you a little bit in this. So how many of you have smelled something and it just brought back a memory that you didn't know you had? Okay, great. How many of you have heard a song and it brought back a memory that you thought you had just completely lost? Okay. How many of you, thank you, by the way, for being so cooperative. I appreciate that. How about being in a place that you haven't been to in a long time? Bring back a memory? Okay. So these are factors that promote recall of obscure memories because they're memories for events, which we call episodic memories. And that's my specialty, what I study. These episodic memories are tied to context, to unique places and time. So in the areas of the brain, especially the brain area called the hippocampus, which is especially important for episodic memory, the hippocampus, it really doesn't just encode, hey, I saw this content. It says, I encoded this content in this place, in this time. And so if there's a cue, like a smell or a taste or a song or being in a place that is uniquely associated with a time in your life, these sensory details can pull up a memory that you didn't know you even had because it was waiting for you to just plug in the right context. And that context gives you the key to open up that memory. Finally, another one is kind of counterintuitive, which is what I call error-driven learning. So we often think if you're trying to memorize something, the best way to do it is try to memorize, right? And so you can see, for instance, kids who are studying for school, if you have kids or grandchildren, they're studying for school, let's say they're taking a Spanish class, they'll try to just repeat these words and memorize them just by repeating them or rereading the textbook over and over again. And that turns out to be a terrible way to remember. It turns out that the way to remember better is to test yourself. There's other ways that kind of fall into this category too. But one big way is to test yourself. In fact, we and others have shown if you are trying to memorize something and you test yourself before you've actually gotten the right answer, that can enhance your memory too. So you don't even have to have the right answer to benefit from testing yourself. Now, this might seem weirdly counterintuitive, right? Why would making a mistake be better than not making a mistake? And you could say, even, if I were a computer and I was trying to create a photographic memory, why would I give my computer the chance to create a wrong memory before we give it the right memory? And the reason is that our memories tend to be noisy. We've got the same neurons that are pulled up every time we're trying to activate the right memory. So sometimes we succeed, but sometimes we fail. But when we get the right information, like you go, oh yeah, now you hear my name and now you remember it. That allows me to repair that cell assembly, that coalition of neurons that was associated with the memory, so that it dumps the neurons that are not diagnostic and strengthens the connections between neurons that are actually diagnostic. And in fact, if you look at all of successful AI, it's based on a similar kind of error-driven learning principle. They call it gradient descent for those of you who are tech people. But beyond that, it's also why, for instance, actually driving, for instance, is going to give you better memory for a place than simply than simply sitting in an Uber and being a passenger in the same route. It's also why rehearsing for a play is a lot better than reading the lines for a play, right? In other words, giving yourself the chance to make a mistake is a learning opportunity. But it's a learning opportunity if you allow it to be. That is, if you allow yourself to struggle and then you give yourself the right answer and you really commit yourself to learning the right answer, that's when error really can be your friend and it allows you to retain this information for much, much longer. So, and by the way, I'll answer questions afterwards just to kind of make sure I get through everything for people who are on a tight schedule. So you might say, okay, well, this is fine, but help me remember everything, right? And you've probably seen movies like the movie Limitless is a really fun one where Bradley Cooper takes some pill and he tries to remember everything. You'll go online and you'll see people trying to sell pills that say they'll give you plasticity if you could remember everything. The fact is, no one remembers everything. And even if you could, you would not want to, okay? So there's one group of people, there are groups of people who have a high degree of memory in narrow areas. One group of people is called people with highly superior autobiographical memory. It's rare, but it's not ridiculously rare. For all I know, there might be one person in this room who has it. But this phenomenon is associated with people being able to go back and remember something for 10 years, 2 months, and 5 days ago. And they can tell you where they were, what the weather was like, who won in the football game that day. They can tell you all sorts of random details about it. Now, it turns out if you give them somebody's phone number or 10 names of people to memorize, they don't necessarily do any better than anyone else. But for whatever reason, for events in their lives, people with highly superior autobiographical memory really, really do get a lot of information and it sticks with them. But if you read descriptions, I actually went online and I just looked on some, forums to just see what's it like to have a highly superior autobiographical memory? Because I'd seen some articles on this, but I wanted to know what happens with regular people. Now, as you know, people who go online tend to be a little bit extreme. So, you got to take it with a grain of salt. This is definitely not, everybody, but this is a description of one person. The name for this, some people describe it as hyperthymesia, but it's the same thing as HSAM. But basically what he says is it feels like hell, drives you absolutely crazy. He says, I wish I had the capability of forgetting things. This is another one where he says, or they say, I don't know what the gender of either of these people were, but they say it is frankly horrific. Trust me when I say no one wants this affliction. Details never fade, time never ever heals. Life is a perpetual open wound, right? Forgetting is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. And in fact, if you think about it, you want to be able to forget, right? So I came here for the weekend from Davis. Now I had a car. I could have stuffed my car with everything. My wife was there too, my dog, and I had a bunch of books, so I couldn't really stuff my car with everything. But I didn't pack everything I had. I tried to guess what I would need for the weekend. Now, I am sure tomorrow morning I'll wake up and be missing something, maybe some medication, maybe I wish I brought my electric toothbrush. And now I realize I forgot that. But, I did forget something. I will also have some things that I'll bring and I'll be like, oh, wait, I brought 5 sets of underwear. I didn't need that for 3 days. So I'll have some things that I didn't need that I ended up bringing with me. But for the most part, I will do pretty good. Now, life is a trip, and your brain is packing memories for this trip. You don't want to pack everything that you could possibly pack into that brain. You want to pack what you need for that trip. And that's why we forget. That's why you want to forget. That's also, by the way, why the human brain consumes less energy than that light bulb, whereas ChatGPT will take down an entire power grid. Our brains are extraordinarily efficient. So I want to get a little bit more philosophical for a moment, which is to think about why we remember, not from a concrete sense like, oh, I need to remember where my keys are, but a deeper kind of question of why are we endowed with the capability of memory? There's lots of things that we can't do, right? We can't remember things that happened before we were born. We can't see infrared light. Most of us can't anyway. We can't hear ultrasonic sound. Why should we be able to remember? What's that about, right? And I want to highlight something by Danny Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize. He was a professor at UC Berkeley. I actually took his class when I was an undergrad. And what Danny said in his book, he talks a lot about the concept that we have two selves, the experiencing self, who actually goes through and lives and does things, and what he called the remembering self, which is the one that calls the shots. The remembering self is what makes the decision. And so in some sense, the experiencing self is stuck with the decisions that the remembering self makes. But not just that, when we think about our lives, I ask you, are you happy? I ask you, are you a sane person? I ask you, do you wish you did more with your life? That's not the experiencing self answering. Because we know, I've told you already, hopefully you're convinced that you won't remember most of your life. And so if I ask you to reflect on your life, it's the remembering self that has that tiny proportion of experiences that's making the decision. Now, Danny would say, well, this is irrational. We should be able to remember things in a more rational way, so that if you went on a trip, on a vacation, and you spent 4 hours sitting in traffic, that should be part of your evaluation of whether or not you go on vacation again. Most of us don't, though, when we decide to go on a vacation, we don't sit around thinking, oh, I'm going to have to go through airport security. You just do it, but that's not part of the decision-making process. You think about the highs and the lows of your past decisions and why you're going to do that. And so what I'm getting at is something very profound that's been hammered home in neuroscience research. So this is a map that was actually taken from my lab, but many, many, many labs have found this. So I took a brain and I inflated it, and I said, what areas show the most activity when people remember an event? You'll get a whole network of areas, and this network of areas turns out to be very interesting because it's the network of areas that's most affected in Alzheimer's disease. But this network is active. Now, if I say, hey, I just want you to listen to this story that I'm going to tell you, and I play a story while I scan people's brain, many of the same brain areas are active. But now I'm not asking people to remember anything. I'm just asking people to understand what's going on. And that lights up almost the same network, a little bit more, but you definitely get the same network. Now I say, I want you to imagine something that could happen in the future, which, maybe you might be thinking, okay, what's going to happen, 3 years from now? I'm thinking about what's going to happen 3 years from now, especially in terms of research funding for biomedical research. But we won't go dark right now. But we can do this process of imagining, and when we do it, the map of brain activity that you get is very, very hard to distinguish from a map of brain activity that you get when people are remembering something. If I showed any expert in the field of memory and I said, here's a brain map. Is it one of somebody imagining or somebody actually remembering? Most people would not be able to tell you. And the reason is simple. The reason is that remembering is not a replay of the past. Sir Frederick Bartlett, who was a memory researcher at the University of Cambridge, he actually came up after Ebbinghaus and he said, you know, Ebbinghaus got it all wrong. Ebbinghaus was basically saying, we're going to look at how much I remember, and we're going to look at that by how much I can regurgitate from my memory. And what Bartlett said was, remembering is not regurgitating. He studied memory in a very different way. He would give people stories, and he would give people, you know, different pictures that were very meaningful, like a painting, and ask people to remember them later on. And what he found was that when people remembered them, they didn't remember them verbatim. They actually remembered a lot of stuff that was not part of the event. They took what they experienced and they reinterpreted it in a way. And so what Bartlett said is, we do not really replay the past. Remembering is what we call an imaginative reconstruction, which is a fancy way of saying we don't replay what happened in the past. We imagine what could have happened in the past. Now, again, this is extraordinarily economical. If I store memories for just little bits, the unique, distinctive parts of an event, and I use my imagination to fill in the rest, now I've saved a lot of space in memory. I'm reducing the problem in memory to just getting the essentials of what I need, and I use my imagination to get the rest. Now, as a result, you can ask, well, can we even trust our memories, right? And I want you to change the way you think about memory. Don't think about memories as being true or false. As I say in my book, memories aren't true or false. They're definitely not like photographs. They're more like paintings. And just to illustrate this, I'm showing you one painting. I got this photo from the internet. But basically, this is a photo of a church that was painted by Vincent van Gogh. And this is the actual church that he painted. Now, what you can see in this painting is, I don't know if he was actually sitting in front of the church when he painted it or if he painted it from memory. I hope he painted it from memory because that would be really cool. But even if he sat and looked at it, what you can see is there's a lot of information in this painting that's very faithful to its subject, right? You've got all of this detail in the stained glass windows that are right. You have this clock tower. There's a clock there. There's two windows. So you can easily recognize this as a painting of this. But there's a lot of stuff here that's not in this, right? So this isn't a perfect thing. You can see there are all these weird curving lines that don't quite match up to the real photo. But more than that, there's a lot of stuff in this painting that's neither true nor false per se. It just reflects the author, the painter's perspective. It just reflects the way they look at the world. And if you were to look at this painting and go, well, this is true and this is false, you're completely missing the point. The painting is a reflection of what the person is remembering, what the person interprets, and their unique take on the world at that time in their lives. And we can all look back at memories from times in our life and see them from a different light than we did before. Like, you might have had a relationship and then the relationship broke up and you're devastated and you're angry and blah, blah, blah. Then you meet someone who turns out to be the love of your life. And now you look back and you laugh at that. And you're like, I can't believe that I was with that person. Boy, I dodged a bullet. That person was crazy. And many of us have these kinds of experiences, or sometimes the opposite. Sometimes people have these experiences where they do something and then later on they look back and like regret it, right? So our memories are constantly shifting like the sands of time. And in fact, our memories can be updated. So I like to say that even if you were to think of memory like replaying a tape, if you did replay a memory in that way, when we hit play, we also hit record. So this is an example I talk about in my book. This is a journalist named Brian Williams. Many of you might recognize him from TV. Brian Williams was at one point at the top of the journalist, the anchor person's game. So he went to Iraq during one of the wars that we had in Iraq, and he was in a helicopter. And so he described this incident later on, and it was kind of a harrowing event. And he describes how that the helicopter in front of them was under fire and it was almost blown out of the sky. Now, later on, he went on a whole bunch of talk shows. So this is 10 years later. And so he's on David Letterman, and he says 2 of our 4 helicopters were hit by ground fire, including the one I was in. So in 10 years, his story entirely changed. Now, he actually mentioned this, I think it was at a hockey game, I might be misremembering, but many veterans who were part of that actual experience said he didn't have this happen to them, we did. And he's actually claiming a memory that's ours. And so, he had a whole controversy about this and eventually lost his job because people said, you're a journalist and your job is to tell the truth. And you're clearly lying to people. And we don't know if he was lying or not, but there's good reason to think in the memory literature, we can make people remember things that never happened. And we can do that by getting people to try to remember things and giving them suggestions. And what happens is when people try to remember an event and then they start to imagine it, well, now you start to fill in the blanks, sometimes with things that didn't happen. And then you get mixed up between your imagination and memory. And it turns out it's really hard to tell the difference between things that you thought about and things that have actually happened. So maybe you're remembering this terrible event, but now you think about it in a different light. Maybe you think about it with yourself being more heroic. And maybe you start to imagine, well, yeah, I was scared, I was terrified. Well, why was I scared? Well, it must have been because I was in the plane that went down. And it turns out if you look at the details of the story, there's a lot that he got right. It's just the most important detail, which is that his plane was shot down, that he didn't get right. So the point I'm trying to make here is that everybody is susceptible to these kinds of errors in memory. So another question I get very often, and I know I'm running a little bit late, but a lot of questions I get concern why memory gets worse as we get older. And I talked about this in an editorial on Joe Biden's memory in the New York Times. And regardless of your political affiliations, I know this is like a sore topic right now, but regardless of this, what I was interested in was I was a memory researcher. And I was hearing a lot of people say, well, he's old and he's senile and blah, blah, blah. And I've heard many, many older people tell me, I'm worried I'm getting senile. And I've heard many younger people say this other person's old and senile. For many older people, ageism is extraordinarily common. And so I wrote this editorial for the bigger picture perspective of saying, well, what is normal aging and what's not normal aging? Well, we know that on average, memory gets worse as we get older. So if you look at episodic memory, this ability to remember events, and you exclude people who are demented or have Alzheimer's disease, you look at many, many studies. This is a very complicated graph. Basically, we plot memory performance on different tests, and you plot it over time. What you find is that as people get older, their memory performance drops down. Now, as you'll see, that drop happens pretty early. Even from the 30s, on average, memory starts to go down. So this looks very bleak, but not all kinds of memory go down. So if you look at general knowledge, what you can see is that on average, across many, many, many studies, general knowledge about the world can stay the same or even go up, right? So if you think about it, for older people, we might not remember where we put our keys, but we have a lot of wisdom, right? And that's not lost as you get older. But we can get a little set in our ways. That's a whole nother conversation. But here's another important point, and this is maybe one of the most important take-home messages I want you to have. This is another plot, and it's a very, very noisy plot. But basically what I'm showing you is an average again, just like I showed you before. But this is an average of many, many people who were tracked over time. And so let's say if I took you and I gave you a memory test, I brought you in a year later, I gave you a memory test, and I tracked your memory performance over time. Each of these gray lines represents one person who was tracked over time. And if you take the average of all of those people, you get the same thing that I just showed you before. Memory performance gets worse as you get older. But here's the interesting thing. Let's look at a couple of people here. So here's one person who's tracked over time, and here's another person who's tracked over time. Their memory dramatically drops off over the course of 10 to 15 years, right? Here's another couple of people over time. They're staying remarkably steady. This person's improving. It's probably not statistically significant. But the most important thing to think about is this is not inevitable. Many people show that, but that's on average, people do that, but lots of people don't. Okay, now I want you to keep another thing in mind, which is when we forget, even if we are forgetting, we can do that even if we have very good memory skills. Even if our abilities are very preserved, we can have trouble remembering. And so I talk about a difference in this article between lowercase forgetting and uppercase forgetting. So lowercase forgetting would be not being able to find the information that we need when we need it. So if you think about, for instance, how many of you been in a situation where you're like, oh, remember that guy who was in that thing and blah, 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 and you know the memory's there and you can't get it. And 1 hour later, when the conversation's long over, it pops into your head. And you think to yourself, okay, I must be totally losing it. Why didn't I remember that? It's clearly there. That is normal age-related forgetting. Most people show that more often as they get older. It has to do, for those of you who are interested, in changes in the prefrontal cortex. But that's very, very common. Now, there's a separate kind of forgetting, which would be what I call capital F forgetting. This is not technical. I just made this up. But capital F forgetting is when you have no memory that an event took place at all. Now, this sometimes happens more often, even in healthy aging too. But if it happens a lot, that's a problem. If you don't remember the name of somebody that you just met an hour ago, that can be very normal. But if you don't remember that you had a conversation with a person who you met an hour ago, that could be more worrisome, right? So it turns out that many of the things that I pointed out in the article that were said to be evidence of a memory disorder turned out to be events that actually he couldn't pull up at the time, but there were things that he probably did remember. Now, again, this is just something that I bring up to apply to your own lives. And the reason this happens is this is a map of brain areas that are active in young college students who are trying to learn something or trying to remember something. And what you see is that there's this area in the prefrontal cortex that massively lights up when people are trying to remember something. There's these other areas in the temporal lobe that are also very important. And so many things that we encounter in daily life can be quite disruptive to the functions of these brain regions. So I'm going to give you a few of those now. So one is stress, right? Stress really downregulates the function of the prefrontal cortex. It has to do with the way it affects the stress hormones affect dopamine receptors in the prefrontal cortex. And so that makes it harder to remember the information that you need when you need it. It also makes it harder to pay attention to what you might be needing to pay attention to in the moment. Another is multitasking. We do this to ourselves. We shoot ourselves in the foot all the time by trying to maintain a conversation while we're checking text messages. I have done this, and I've sat around in many academic conferences with memory researchers who check email while they're attending an academic talk. So this is definitely something that we all know better, but we still do it. Major memory block. Fatigue, insomnia, big memory blocker. Illness. We're seeing this now with long COVID, actually. Depression. These are all factors that can really wreak havoc with your memory. I've actually, when I was in grad school, I tested people who were older adults with clinical depression, and their memory performance was worse than somebody in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. I want you to just register that for a moment. Clinical depression can produce memory deficits that can be worse than somebody in a very early stage of Alzheimer's. That's how significant it is. So I want you to really think about lifestyle factors that you can take home to do to improve your memory today. And everybody asks me, will something that I can do improve my memory? As part of my kind of being an author, I've had to create an Instagram account. And I see all sorts of garbage being peddled by all sorts of people, podcasters or advertisers who are all like, do this simple thing and this simple hack will improve your memory overnight, blah, blah, blah. Take my supplement, drink this, eat that, right? And so people are always asking me, well, can I get this quick fix from doing something to improve your memory? And it could be a supplement, it could be food, it could be whatever, something, playing Sudoku. And the answer is it might. That's the answer I usually get. And the reason is that essentially, if you look at the best things like eating blueberries or certain things like that show good results, even there the effect sizes are really small. And now you take things like ginkgo or some of the latest supplement that people are trying to push. And by the way, they'll go, oh, we're going to restore plasticity in your brain. Every one of you has plenty of plasticity. Maybe not as much as you did when you were 20 years younger, but you have plenty of plasticity to do what you need to do. So it's not that. Taking a drug might help you. Taking some supplement might help you. But if you look at the effect sizes in the studies that show positive effects, they're so small that what that means is, yeah, on average, some people benefited, some people got nothing, some people got worse. And a lot of that was just chance variability. Maybe some proportion of people has helped. Now, the placebo effect is a very, very real effect. So if you do take these things and you feel like it's working, believe in it, because that's actually in and of itself important. So whatever you do, if you do Sudoku, you do brain games, you pay for some $100 a month like nootropics, go for it. Just believe in it. If your doctor says it's okay, your bank account is fine with that, I don't care. So that's all fine. But here's something that's very important, which is there are lifestyle factors that everybody can do that will improve your memory very soon and improve your quality of life and improve your health. This is just one study that I love to show. This was a study that was done. I know I'm running a little late. I'm sorry. I should close up soon. But this is one study that I found that was of 29,000 people. This is a very, very large study. They did very, very crude measures of memory. And these were healthy people. And they looked at 6 lifestyle factors. Again, very, very crude. Never drinking, not smoking, what they called cognitive activity. I mean, this is not what a psychologist would design, or at least, somebody who studies memory. But they just took these things, active social contact, hugely important nowadays, exercise and so forth. And they divided people up according to whether they had 4 to 6 of these factors going for them, 2 to 3, or 0 to 1. Now, just to keep things simple, let's focus on the group that's favorable and the group that's unfavorable. So when they started this study in 2009 and they looked at memory performance, everybody more or less was performing about the same. Now they follow them up at 2012, 2014, 16, and 19. Now, as you can imagine, everybody gets a little bit worse based on what I've shown you. On average, people get worse over the years. And that's what they found. And it didn't matter, the lifestyle factors, everybody group gets worse. But here's what I want you to take home. Let's just draw a little line here for the best and the worst. And I'm sorry, the people who had the most positive lifestyle factors, the people who had the fewest going for them. And let's just fast forward to 10 years ahead, right? What you can see is here's the memory performance for the good lifestyle. Here's the memory performance for the last lifestyle. The people with the good lifestyle are almost performing twice as high as the people with the bad lifestyle. That's a 10-year difference, and you're preserving 50% more of your memory, or you're losing 50. Don't ask me to do math up here, but the point is that if I were to give you some drug and give people a drug and say, hey, this drug might cause diarrhea, but it's going to help you preserve your memory in 10 years, many people would probably take it. These lifestyle factors will probably reduce your instance of diarrhea. It'll also improve your quality of life, reduce your risk for heart disease. The list goes on and on. I mean, it's really amazing. And this is a complicated picture because I'm close on time. I just want to say that that was just healthy memory. A report in the Lancet that came out in 2024 showed that almost half of the risk factors that are risks for Alzheimer's, factors that promote risk for Alzheimer's disease, are lifestyle factors that can be prevented or modified. Okay, it's under your control. So if everybody was following these lifestyle factors, I believe the way the analysis worked, we would have maybe a little more, but about half of the number of Alzheimer's cases than we do have. And this is just one cause of dementia. It's the most common, but there's others too. So last thing I'm going to give you is to say, some take-home messages here, which is how you can improve your memory, right? So one is try to remember more by leveraging what you already know. We can always remember more by memorizing less. If you know something already, you don't need to memorize it. So try to attach meaning to the things that you're trying to memorize. And it turns out that meaning can be an anchor for you. Another thing is what I call planting cues, which is basically, I talk about this if you listen to the podcast, 10% Happier with Dan Harris. He's got a little clip of me talking about one thing. But basically, if you think about something that you have to do in the future, think about something that's going to be there at the moment that you need to remember it, right? So you're trying to remember to take out the trash. Maybe imagine yourself walking home and you look at this garden gnome that you have in your garden, and then that garden gnome is telling you, hey, take out the trash. It's a weird thing that you can imagine, but I guarantee you when you go home and you see that gnome, you will remember this weird thing that you came up with and you'll take out the trash. So cues are key to reducing the amount of work that we need to do to spontaneously remember. If I have a reminder out in the world, why do I need to remind myself? The last thing is, if you're trying to memorize things that are really tough, give yourself the opportunity to fail. If you're trying to memorize someone's name, test yourself on it before you have the chance to forget it. Challenge yourself by attempting to recall the things that you need to remember in different contexts even. I think this is hugely important. I mean, I love to talk about this in the context of education. It's hugely important. And then just keep in mind, try to remember better, not more. You're not going to remember everything. So focus on what matters. Because I guarantee you, most of you, because I do this myself, go through life without thinking about what's important to take away from this. You go on a holiday and you don't think about, what do I really want to remember from this? You just expect to get everything for free. But if you prioritize what matters and focus your attention on those things, you will remember better. You will remember the things that matter to you. And that's because memory is not about the past. It's about making sense of the present and thinking about what you want to carry with you the future. So again, I want to ask you, just take this home and think about it. What are the memories that you want to carry with you to the future? So thank you very much. Happy to answer questions. I'll be signing books at the end too. But yeah, thank you. And maybe if you can moderate for me, that'll really help.
Let's go here. I'm trying to remember one of the first lines.
Good, that's the first step. And if I correct you, then you'll really remember it.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Last that weren't associated with emotion.
Oh, yeah.
So can you bring that together for me?
Yeah, I mean, this was just like some things. I mean, I could talk for a whole another 2 hours about with more tips. But basically, so the reason why I brought those up was that these are things that you can do and hacks that you can execute and strategies. Often our emotions just happen, right? And so these are but you can obviously manage your emotions And one that I talk about a lot in my book is curiosity. It turns out we've done work on this in my lab. And it turns out if you stimulate curiosity, maybe I've done that with you with this talk, it turns out it actually activates circuits in your brain that process the chemical dopamine, which promotes plasticity, as you might remember. And it gives you a certain emotional state. And it turns out the research on curiosity suggests that curiosity isn't necessarily pleasurable. It's more of this kind of a thing like an itch. I mean, it can be pleasurable, it can be a desire, but it can also, and it energizes you, but it can also be unpleasant. But getting into a state of curiosity, as it turns out, we've shown that it can enhance memory for even things that you're not curious about. It puts your brain in more of a sponge-like state to suck information up. So that's a kind of emotion that you can generate yourself that can actually be helpful. And so I think, like, and this is why clickbait works so well, because they always ask some question that makes you go, wait a minute, that's kind of counterintuitive. Or, you see like, or if you have a good teacher, a teacher won't tell you, here's what you need to memorize. They'll get you thinking about the question before they give you the answer, right? And this is true of any kind of successful communication you want to do too. So that would be an example of where you can harness emotion in a way that actually can help you remember better.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. We don't really know. Yeah. Oh, sorry about that. I'm supposed to repeat the questions for Zoom. So yeah. So the question is that when you actually, this is good because I can make sure I remember your question. So when we dream, we sometimes wake up and we don't remember what we dreamed about, or even if we do, we just remember a little bit of the dream. So why is it that we don't remember the dream so well? And we don't know the answer to that. We don't even know, for instance, we have good reason to believe that dreaming happens during a particular stage of sleep. So I do talk about sleep in the book. And one of the things we know is that while you're sleeping, your brain's actually doing lots of stuff. It's not like you're doing nothing. Brain's actually doing lots of stuff. It's clearing out amyloid proteins, which are some of the toxins that build up over the course of the day. It's doing a lot in terms of stabilizing memories that you formed over the course of the day. And it also seems to be doing something else. And we know during a particular stage of sleep called REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep, that's when people dream a lot. It turns out that these neuromodulators, many of them are very low during REM sleep. And so what people think, one idea, and we have a computational model of this, there's another person who has an even better computational model of this, is that maybe what happens is during the different stages of sleep, you have these periods, like when you're deeply, deeply asleep, where memories can become stabilized. You replay the most important memories of the day, and those memories can become stabilized. And then during REM sleep, your brain starts to throw everything together and see, well, I've had all of these memories over the past few months. Let me just reactivate some randomly and let my brain free associate them and see what sticks. And there, you don't want to store the memories for the actual dream that you're having, but your brain's trying to make sense of what's happening when your brain's kind of free associating. And that's why dreams have this quality that sort of like feels real, but it doesn't make any sense, right? Because your brain's kind of randomly trying to find things that stick together. And so this is all speculation, by the way. But because it's happening during the state with low modulators, you're not necessarily remembering the dream itself, but you're going to remember something, the knowledge that sort of sticks across all of these different free associations that happen during dream. That's what we think. But again, this is utterly speculative. When we do remember dreams, though, it appears to be the case that it happens because we wake up in the middle of the dream. And then it's so fresh in your mind that even if you didn't have the neuromodulators before, you will when you wake up. This is a great question. It's one that I think about a lot. Oh, yeah, sorry. Thank you. See, I already forgot. So, do you think AI is going to have any effect on the way we remember? Yes and no. So, one question, I mean, one thing that we know is that AI works very differently than our brains. There's a lot of people who go, oh, ChatGPT can reason. It can't reason. It just predicts the next word. But ChatGPT has memorized virtually the entire internet. So if people put a lot of smart things on the internet where they show, here's how equations work, here's how algebra works, here's how to write a computer program, and it memorizes that, it can regurgitate that quite well. So that's how it works. It's kind of a photographic memory, but it's also doing something different because it's trying to aggregate the kind of averages of things that it's memorized. We can do that, and that's what's called semantic memory, but we also have episodic memory that's very unique, that reflects our lived experiences, where I can draw back to something that happened to me in college, this weird experience that I had with my roommate who just had a completely different background than me. And that can be one memory that I have that no one else in this audience has. And that's something that can't be replicated with AI. And so that's why human creativity, for instance, can be very different from AI generated creative works, because humans have that unique perspective that we talk about. Now, will AI affect the way we remember? I think it can, and I am somewhat worried about it. So if you look, for instance, at text messaging, people adapted their language to text messaging, right? People started to develop all sorts of acronyms to make things easier to text. Now we have programs that will auto-complete, sentences for us based on kind of next word prediction, and they'll create entire sentences for us. Well, these sentences are based on kind of the lowest common denominator of what's seen on the internet, right? But if it's easy, we will sort of default to that. And now the next time I write something, maybe I will write more like ChatGPT because my brain's gotten trained to put out that information. It's like I might have had a different sentence in mind, but ChatGPT corrected it. And so now through error-driven learning, my brain says, oh, maybe that's how I should do it the next time around, because it's easier. And my brain wants to save energy. And so what can happen is the tail can wag the dog. And eventually what can happen is that people's memories can become, people's behavior can become trained to fit more with what happens in AI. The other thing that I'm very, very worried about, and I'm sure this has happened, especially with regards to recent events with the election, because there's such misinformation campaigns that have been put out there, is that people will see things, and these things that they see in social media, for instance, could be deep fakes, like pictures of things that have never happened. They could also be just pictures that are made up and somebody says they're made up, right? But somebody puts out a bunch of ideas out there. And these ideas aren't true, they're misinformation. But then you've heard that person say it on a podcast, and that person's kind of famous. And then somebody else regurgitated and retweeted that or whatever, right? So you start to hear the same thing from people. And especially these are people who you see over and over again, and they start to get famous. And so now those data points that you get in memory seem more fluent to you. They seem easier to process. And that's how our brains determine whether something seems true. We also have trouble because if it's something we want to believe, we can imagine it. Some politician who we hate, and we hear that in fact that they did something illegal. We can imagine that because we hate that person. And so now what happens is I've imagined something, somebody gave me some misinformation that's consistent with that. Now it's really hard to tell the difference between something that actually happened versus something that we thought about, because it's all just memories. And so that is, I think, the deepest threat that we have. And that's why it's very, very important for people to think about what they're exposing themselves to, think about the sources of the information they get, and to think about if somebody tells you something that you want to hear, that's the stuff you should be most suspicious of, because that's when your brain will really want to default to that and confuse it with things that you remember.
So maybe one question.
Yeah. So there's something called, so in fact, actually, my former advisor was a pioneer. Oh, sorry. The question is, can you train your mind to, I won't get into all the editorializing about education, but we can talk about that later. But can you train your mind to be able to tell the difference between misinformation, even if you've heard it many, many times, to tell the difference between misinformation and things that are true, right? And you can. In fact, people are quite good at it. We don't actually confabulate in our lives very often, right? We don't remember things that have never happened very often. We're usually pretty good about telling the difference in reality and things that we just thought about. So we can do it. It's not like all of us are living in la la land. And so my former advisor has done a lot of work on this topic. One of the things that we know, though, is that it becomes harder to tell the difference because we often use these quick and dirty rules called heuristics. Again, Danny Kahneman, who I showed you in Thinking Fast and Slow, he talks a lot about this. That when we're trying to do things quickly, do a quick and dirty thing, we often fail to tell the difference between facts and reality, right? Facts and fiction. And it's the same reason that I can tell you, okay, have you ever eaten a rambutan before? Now, most of you, if you've never eaten a rambutan before, you don't have to think about everything you've ever eaten in your life. You could just say, wow, that's a really weird word. I've never heard that before. And again, you have to think about every word you've ever heard. Your brain had to struggle so much just to even hear what I said. That's enough that you can quick and dirty say that's something I've never heard before. On the other hand, if I say, hey, have you seen an apple in the past 24 hours? That's going to be a little bit harder for you because you've seen a lot of apples in your life. You know that just based on how familiar that word is to you. And that's based on how quickly your brain can process that information. So misinformation that we've heard many, many, many times can be processed very quickly and very easily. And that is the stuff that we are most likely to accept as true, right? So there's a great study that was done where this researcher just exposed people to a bunch of names of random people. And it turned out people in the experiment later on would look at this name and say, yeah, that person is famous. And you go, why? And I don't know, that person's really famous. Well, that person was only famous because the experimenter showed them the name several times. It wasn't because this person was an actual celebrity. The name was entirely made up. So we have these quick and dirty rules that we use. So to really be able to tell the difference, this is true of everybody. This is true of implicit bias and stereotyping. There's so many ways in which this applies. And no matter what your political persuasion and how trained you are, if you are stressed out and you're checking your email while you're maintaining a conversation and you're constantly moving from one thing to another, you're overworked, you're overscheduled, you are going to be much, much, much more susceptible to misinformation. It's just the way it is.
One final question from Martha, and then we're going to wrap up there.
And I can answer some more while we're signing books too. Yeah, it's a great question. So the question is that in terms of the chemical changes that happen in the brain during learning, is there a continuum that it's like you can have more, and you get a stronger memory, or you get less, and you get a weaker memory? In the neuroscience literature, they tend to think of it exactly like what you're talking about. There's there's a more complicated story than what I told you, much more complicated. Um, and then there's like simpler versions of what I told you, which is essentially that these neurons communicate with each other via these neurotransmitters, these chemicals that are released in the synapse. And under the right conditions, if the activation is strong enough, and if these chemicals, these neuromodulators are released in the brain, what can happen is that there's genes that are activated in these neurons that activate more receptors, and they create more receptors in those synapses. so that the same amount of chemical can now be much more likely to activate those other neurons. And so now, if I've activated 3 of the neurons in those coalition, now those neurons are much more likely to be able to recruit their friends to come in and get them online so that you remember the right thing. So in the neuroscience literature, they'll say, well, that's a strong memory will have more of those receptors that are created. Now, the problem is that sometimes we can have a memory that is perfectly strong in that sense, but weak in the sense of you're not being able to remember it because you're not in the right context. You don't have the right cues in front of you. And so your ability to actually remember something doesn't necessarily correspond precisely to the strength of the change that happens during learning.